A confirmation about the audio, please, guys, if the audio is available. Thank you. So now we talk about the portion of global dimming. Now, what is referred to as dimming? So dimming is used in an everyday parlance whenever we talk about, let's say, dimming of light, isn't it? When you lower the intensity of something. Now, this is a larger phenomena because of the amount of pollution which is carried out, because of the amount of emission which is carried out. Due to that, in many particular areas of the planet, there has been a significant reduction in the amount of solar insolation received. Why? Because these pollutants which persist in the atmosphere, they will in a way reduce the amount of solar insolation which falls upon the surface. So that is what ends up creating a phenomena of global dimming. So it is defined as the decrease in the amount of solar radiation reaching the surface of the earth. That is what is referred to as global dimming. Now, throughout the 70s and the 80s, and even for some part of the early 90s, the amount and the level of pollution which was observed in the region of Europe and North America, that would be very, very high. The emissions throughout the 60s and the later portions of 70s, etc., the amount of pollutant and particulate matter over these regions of Western Europe and America would be very high. It was their time for economic progression and economic growth. So at that point of time, it would reduce significant amount of solar intensity and solar insolation falling upon those areas. But for the past couple of decades, the amount of these pollutants and the pollutant load being emitted from the regions such as India and China, they have been so significantly large that it has provided a kind of a dimming phenomena in these regions. Now, various different areas, they experience the amount of global dimming in comparison to the various regions. Northern hemisphere, and when you have a comparative study, northern hemisphere overall receives lesser amount of solar insolation as compared to the southern hemisphere. Okay, so northern hemisphere has witnessed more significant reduction in global dimming. And why is that? Can we have an account of the reason that why is it that the northern hemisphere has more amount of global dimming? Yes, good. Right, continent, and largely populated as well. Perfect. That is because the northern hemisphere is dominated by landmass, and it is the northern hemisphere where you have significant amount of population residing and hence greater amount of emissions. So northern hemisphere has greater amount of land and population, hence greater emission. Okay, and due to that, you have the occurrence of the phenomena of dimming. So dimming is much greater in the region of the northern hemisphere. Now the regions of Europe and North America, now they have recovered from that portion of global dimming, and that is only experienced in Europe in very rare cases whenever you have, let's say, significant amount of volcanic eruptions and volcanic outburst in the region of Iceland, for example. That provides some temporary dimming. Otherwise, the European and the American region, that is largely experiencing a cleaner air for the past few decades. And it is the Asian giants of China and India which are experiencing dimming because of increased amount of emissions. So that is where China and India have experienced increased amount of emissions. Now, when this global dimming happens, is it good or is it bad? So here, whenever dimming happens, so ideally you would think that there is going to be some amount of cooling of the surface. But then you have to understand that that particular bit of cooling which could have happened because of lesser insulation, that is counteracted by the greater emissions of greenhouse gases. So the greenhouse gases anyways will be trapping a significant amount of heat. But at the same time, this amount of dimming, it reduces the availability of photosynthetically active radiation. So it reduces the productivity of the plant species. So where the plant species, they are not able to carry out photosynthesis quite significantly and quite productively. And that is where the productivity in the ecosystem, the productivity in the environment, that is something which is on a decline. So that is why you have reduced productivity which is experienced. Productivity from photosynthesis. It also provides for a variation in the various different ocean currents and ocean circulation pattern as well. And why is that? Is primarily because that it will cool down the water sufficiently, and that will in a way interrupt the kind of motion in the ocean currents that are present. So water in the northern hemisphere has become colder in certain regions, but then this is not a uniform impact. Many regions, for example in the Atlantic, the water is becoming warmer. So it is nowhere a kind of a uniform impact, but then in general, in certain areas, you experience that. So if the water has become cooler, so that has a slower evaporation and lesser water droplets. That means lesser amount of rain. And when you have lesser amount of rain, that brings in droughts and dry seasons and dry spells for a longer duration. Okay, so this reduces the amount of rain reaching certain parts of the globe, resulting in droughts and famine situation. So that is because of cooling of water in certain areas, okay, due to which you have lesser amount of rainfall. It negatively impacts the process of photosynthesis in the plants as well. So these are the impacts of global dimming. Now this is relevant again for your prelims portion, because global dimming is not something for which, or if UPSC is asking this in the mains examination, it will be a kind of a part of a question. It won't be the entirety of the main question unless and until it again comes into prominence in the portion of current affairs. It won't form a part of a larger question that UPSC is going to ask you. Now, then we come to the process of deforestation. Now, deforestation is carried out because of various different reasons, various different purposes, from the process of urbanization to the process of, let's say, extension of agriculture, for the extraction of wood, for mining purposes, for infrastructure building. So, the causes of deforestation are many. Now, deforestation is significantly damaging. Now, while we will talk about and while we are aware about most of the causes or most of the impacts of deforestation, such as it leads to the loss of the habitat, loss of biodiversity, etc. But when we talk about deforestation, you have to understand that these plants, they end up storing carbon dioxide. They capture carbon dioxide and store that carbon within them. Now, once you end up cutting a particular tree or end up cutting a particular forest, now all that stored carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere. So, due to that, the area becomes a net emitter of carbon dioxide. Okay, so cutting a tree releases methane and also CO2. So, earlier we had seen that the trees, they are natural sinks of carbon dioxide. Why? Because they naturally end up storing carbon dioxide. But once you cut down these trees, they become the emitters of carbon dioxide. There is another impact created by deforestation that we experience in the northeastern part of the country. And that is the rainfall pattern also ends up changing. So deforestation changes the rainfall pattern. Rainfall pattern. How? Now, even though we would have discussed this in the portion of geography earlier, but just to provide a kind of a recap for all of you. Now, please understand, in any particular area, it is not the total amount of rainfall which is changing for the past few years. It is that distribution of rainfall which is undergoing a significant amount of change. How? So, for example, take the case of Northeast itself, and first of all, understand the mechanism behind it. So, suppose in a region, let's suppose you have the presence of trees and significant amount of trees for that matter. Let's suppose. Now, normally, under normal circumstances, these trees, through the process of transpiration, they continue to supply the presence of water vapor into the atmosphere through the normal process of transpiration. That water vapor is consistently supplied. And that water vapor, eventually, after reaching a height, can condense and will end up providing a uniformity in terms of rainfall whenever you have a wind movement, or whenever you have, in our case, let's say monsoonal movement, that will further aid to the provision of continuous rainfall. But then, if let's say you cut down these trees, if you cut down these trees, then what happens? That provision and supply of water vapor into the atmosphere, that gets inhibited, that completely gets stopped in a way, because that transpiration is not carried out anymore. So as a result of that, this region will be dependent completely on the monsoonal rain and the monsoonal cloud systems which bring about. Now, oftentimes it also happens that, let's suppose the monsoonal clouds they approach. If there is a presence of already an existent amount of water vapor, or already an existent some amount of cloud cover there, so that cloud will bring rainfall, some amount of rainfall first, and then the monsoonal rain slowly and steadily will be received. But if you remove the earlier portion, and if you remove these trees, no clouds would be present earlier. So then you will have the rainfall completely dependent upon the monsoonal clouds. So that means you will have prolonged dry spells followed by a very short duration of very intense rainfall, and then followed by again prolonged dry spell. So rather than having, let's assume, 2 centimeter of rainfall every other day, you will have 10 to 12 days of dry condition, 1 to 2 days of excessive rainfall, followed again by 10 to 12 days of dry condition. So that brings simultaneous occurrence of droughts or occurrence of devastating floods, and these floods can cause landslides, avalanches, and other types of natural disasters as well. So you have prolonged dry spell followed by very heavy rainfall, creating flash floods, followed by drought conditions. Drought like conditions. Okay, so that is what is regarded as deforestation, or that is the impact of deforestation overall. So, deforestation is the permanent destruction of forests in order to make the land available for other uses and other utilities. About 300 billion tons of carbon is stored in the trees. That is almost 40 times the total amount of greenhouse gases emitted from fossil fuel burning. That much amount of carbon is stored in the trees. Now, once you talk about the trees, now trees are the natural sinks of carbon dioxide. So if you cut down the trees, not only will the capacity of the planet to absorb carbon dioxide reduce, it will start emitting carbon dioxide along with that. So, deforestation of trees not only lessens the amount of carbon stored, it also releases carbon dioxide into the air. So, the regions become net emitter. Become net emitter. Yes, very good. So, as a result of that, global warming is exaggerated. Becomes exaggerated. Okay. Then, deforestation also releases nearly a billion ton of carbon into the atmosphere every year. Billion ton of carbon into the atmosphere. Now, though the numbers are not as high as the ones recorded in the previous decade because the rate of deforestation has reduced. If you observe historically for the past 100 years, the rate at which deforestation has happened in the region of Europe and North America is something which is not even worth giving example of. Now, large areas of Western Europe, because it would be marshy and organic compound laden soil. So, large areas were under very dense forest. And a lot of these large areas have been cleared systematically. That is why, in when we talk about even the wildlife population and the type of wildlife, Europe doesn't have a lot of wildlife which is left because all of the forests have been cleared out. Okay. Now, deforestation is the second largest. Again, whenever you come across these parameters, this is relevant for your prelims. It is the second largest anthropogenic source or the human caused source of carbon dioxide emission into the atmosphere. And it is also having an impact on the exchange of water vapor from the trees into the atmosphere, which will in a way influence the type of rain or the amount of rainfall, the distribution of rainfall which is received. So the impact of deforestation on exchange of water vapor and carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and the land surface is the biggest concern. So it causes disturbance to the water cycle, to the water cycle. Okay. Now, that is the actual impact of it. Can we say deforestation is less in India compared to industrial developed nations? Historically, yes. If you consider all the historical parameters, yes. But then, even when we talk about the British Raj or the British era, now the Britishers, they actually single handedly managed to clear the entire Terai belt from the forested landscape. If you talk about the region of northern part of Uttar Pradesh, northern part of Bihar, almost 150 years back or almost around 100 years back, these were very densely populated with trees. Not 100 years back, but close to around 150 years back. Very densely populated with trees. But large scale forest deforestation was carried out for manufacturing of railway sleepers, for manufacturing of paper pulp, etc. So this is one of the reasons why the Tarai belt of the Himalayas, that is in these areas, at one point of time you would also be witness to significant amount of rhino population, significant amount of tiger population would be found there. But now, rarely you find tigers there, other than areas such as Pilibhit, other than the areas such as the Dudhwa National Park, the Corbett Reserve, etc. Buxa. Buxa in West Bengal, the northern part of West Bengal, would have historically, if you take a look at the historical accounts, it would be dominated by the tiger population, rhino population as well. But rhinos now have been restricted where? In the region of Assam, isn't it? Why? Because of massive level of deforestation. So historically, the rate of deforestation in Western countries have been very high. In India, developmental requirements have led to deforestation for the past few years. Now there has been an increased amount of understanding, increased amount of awareness, increased amount of government clamp down on deforestation due to the various different laws, the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, for example, the passing of the forest policy of 1988, and also the periodic survey which is carried out. So even though as the periodically released forest survey reports, they indicate that the amount of forested landscape in India overall is increasing, but then the very dense forests, their proportion is decreasing continuously. Okay, so if you talk about the past 2 decades, the regions of very dense regions under very dense forest, they have reduced by few thousand square kilometers, which is significantly huge. Now, whenever you replace very dense forest with a kind of an open forest, that means lesser density of trees. Not only will the amount of carbon capture be impacted, but along with that, you will also have a large impact created on the type of biodiversity which can live there, the various different types of food web networks which can be established. Okay. Pranay, due to Haritaharam, some amount of forest cover is increased in Telangana. But Pranay, here that is largely in certain areas, green cover has increased, you can say. And even in Telangana, it is around the region of only Hyderabad. That is where the Haritaharam program has been implemented across the outer ring road area of Hyderabad. That is where the green cover is being increased. But then in the rest of the region of Telangana, Telangana traditionally has been a dry state in terms of the amount of rainfall. So there also significant amount of deforestation has been carried out. So slowly and steadily it will come back, and it is something where the as larger amount of public awareness will come into the picture, there will be greater amount of greenery which will come to the fore as well. And here you have to understand, it is the large scale connivance and nexus between many of the smugglers, many of the administrative officials, because I always maintain, and which is also the fact, and you would also have experienced it, if the authorities decide that there won't be a single tree which should be cut down, there won't be a tree which would be cut down. That is the power that the state has. By state, I mean the country or any administration. That is the power that the state has. So if they decide truly from even tomorrow that no trees would be cut down illegally, they would be able to enforce that clampdown. But the problem is that even the bureaucrats, they end up earning huge amounts, particularly the forest services. There is a large amount of income which is generated by the cutting down of these commercial trees. And when you talk about the region of Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, there is always that red sanders and the smuggling of red sanders that is carried out in huge quantity, due to which the red sander population, which at one point of time used to be so very dominant in that region, and the forests would look very visually appealing. Now that has been replaced by eucalyptus and other fast growing trees, so that by satellite images the difference is not immediately visible, but it is the biologists who will indicate the amount of damage that it has. Okay. Now, here, deforestation, as I told you, will have an impact, debilitating impact on the water cycle. It has disturbed the amount of vapor flow as well. So, what are the other effects of deforestation overall? You come across or you witness a loss of species. Significant amount of species is lost, right? Why? Because there is loss of habitat and also fragmentation of habitat. What is fragmentation of habitat? Where the existing habitat or the existing region where a species lives, that has been broken down into smaller chunks. Now, the species or the wild animals, they will never be restricted, or naturally, they have not been built to be restricted in a small area. So they oftentimes they end up roaming around in search for fresh prey, in order to search for newer access areas, newer territories where water will be available, etc. But whenever you have fragmentation of habitats, so the animals are restricted to a smaller portion, and that leads to an increase in the level of competition, increase in the level of competition. amongst the species. Okay. And when you have an increase in the competition level, that means many of them, many species are pushed out of existence or pushed into extinction. Now, the fragmentation of habitat and the loss of habitat also, in a way, forces the species and the wild animals to venture into the regions where you have human settlements. And that brings into picture the frequent man-animal conflict which is caused due to the process. So this also contributes to frequent man-animal conflict. Asif, if species loss, then how competition increases? My dear friend, look at it from the other perspective. That because there is an increase in competition, why will there be an increase in competition? Because now all the various different species are restricted to the smaller area, isn't it? When they are restricted to the smaller area, there will be greater amount of fight for the territorial control, and that means many of them will die. For example, take the case of cheetahs. I'm not saying that the cheetahs in Kuno have died because of the fragmentation of habitat, but if you observed and if you have analyzed the deaths, obviously this is being reported continuously that the cheetahs have been dying. Now, there have been 2 to 3 deaths which have been reported because of fights amongst the cheetahs, where one of them in those fights they get damaged or they get hurt and they are unable to hunt anymore, or there is a significant amount of internal organ damage which happens, and due to which they die in the long run. So that is where whenever you have a increase in competition, more or less many of the species will be pushed out. It is always going to be the survival of the fittest, and the other species, they are not given a chance to survive. Yes, Pranit, that is correct. Asif, is that understood, my dear friend, or is there a doubt which still prevails? I hope that is understood, that it is not that species are pushed into extinction and then there is increased competition. It is the other way around. Because there will be an increase in competition. Why? Because of lesser available resources. And lesser available resources means you will have the survival of the fittest. Okay. Now, then water cycle we have talked about. Now, whenever you carry out deforestation, the land is left barren. Their topsoil is then loose. And then that topsoil can be carried off by the surface runoff of the water, by the wind movement, and it leads to soil erosion. And soil erosion eventually will lead to significant amount of land degradation as well. It will lead to significant land degradation. Okay. The quality of life in terms of when we talk about the forest dwelling communities, and in general when we talk about the temperature is experienced in any particular area, the availability of water, availability of ecosystem services provided by the forest, all of that deteriorates significantly. Cheetahs die, there are any cause, but in Hindu paper it's report natural death. There are multiple causes for the same, and many of them can be attributed to the natural causes. For example, if I think we'll be talking about it in the portion of conservation, or the conservation measures and cheetah relocation program, when we'll be talking about that. In Indian Express today, it is reported tigers were fed food even after being left in the wild. Yes, not, yeah, that is also true. So here, see, understand this, that there have been multiple reasons for the death of these cheetahs, and try to understand them. Okay, don't start not noting it down or learning them. Try to understand them. So first reason for the immediate deaths that were occurred was basically because these cheetahs, they have been kept in captivity for very long. And when they are kept, now these wild animals, they are not the ones who are habituated to be kept in captivity, right? Even if you provide them food, even if you provide them with water, it is not equivalent to being roaming in the wild, exploring newer territories. These are wild animals. So due to, and there were various different bureaucratic paperwork and hurdles, due to which there was a long amount of time before the cheetahs from South Africa were introduced. Now, they had been kept in enclosure for a very long period of time, due to which the amount of internal functioning of the body that got significantly impacted. And that caused renal failures or kidney failures in the earlier or the initial deaths which happened. Then after that, you had a significant amount of deaths or a couple of deaths which were caused because of internal conflicts among the cheetahs, where there was a sustained internal body damage which was caused, internal organ failure which happened, due to which couple of cheetahs died. Now this can also be attributed as a natural cause itself. Then the recent deaths which were happening were because of the infections. There was a septicemia which developed, and that was developed because of the collar, the radio collar that was installed upon them. Now that radio collar basically created a kind of a skin wound, and that skin wound festered for long, that increased the level of infection, which again killed those cheetahs. Again, that can be cited as a natural process. Then couple of deaths have also been reported. In total, there are have been 9 deaths. So couple of deaths have happened where it was found out, and including the portion of the collars, where it has been found out that these cheetahs traditionally, they have been habituated to the African environment and African conditions. Now in Africa, in many of these areas, the winter becomes cold, so significantly colder. Now, in order to take care of themselves for the winter, they naturally grow a long coat of fur. The fur starts growing significantly. Now, in Indian conditions, presently when the monsoon, etc., everything has come into the picture. Now, many of these, not all of them, but few of these cheetahs have continued to develop that seasonal growth of fur. Now, in the monsoon condition with increased amount of fur, that has not been suitable for them. And also, it has increased the amount of parasites and infections and the festering of the various different microbes into their body. And aided by that particular scar created by those collar, the radio tracking collar, the level of infection has increased and their body's resilience has lowered down. So that has also caused significant amount of deaths in the case of the cheetahs. Okay, so I hope you understood all the various different reasons there. So I hope we don't need to repeat that and revise that again when we talk about cheetah relocation program. So these have created the multiple different deaths which have occurred. Now there is a point of view, obviously, which tells, which is consistently harping and consistently maintaining the same tune, that the government should never have tried the relocation of cheetah. It was doomed from get go, and it is foolishness on the part of the government to try this. But the idea of relocation of cheetahs have been carried out for decades now. It is not something which one fine morning one bureaucrat dreamt about it, that what if we have cheetahs in our own backyard. It is not a kind of a such a haste movement. This has been dragged in the courts as well for multiple decades now. So that is one of the part of the opinion. The other part of the opinion is that, look, there is always an important factor of natural selection, which was provided by Charles Darwin. When Charles Darwin talked about the evolution of species, Charles Darwin talked about the concept of natural selection. And that natural selection said that in any new habitat or any particular habitat, it will always be those particular species who are able to adapt to that habitat or that ecosystem who will be able to survive. So survival of the fittest was derived from that natural selection, that the nature selects the fittest of them and the weaker ones gradually are eliminated. So many biologists and environmentalists, even from the region of South Africa, they have opined that look, this was bound to happen. This is something that you have to account for. And in fact, even the policymakers, they have accounted for it. That is why in their long term plan, it was always there that we will continue to introduce cheetahs into the ecosystem, and we would continue to bring close to around 120 to 140 individual cheetahs from the various different countries to provide a sustainable reproductive ecosystem, so that after that the fittest will continue to survive and continue to reproduce. So this is where not all the cheetahs, mind you, have developed that kind of a fur coat. Few of the cheetahs have already adapted to the changing conditions in India. So that again is the nature's method of natural selection. Okay, so I hope you understand that it is a part of the longer natural process. If anybody had that expectation that the cheetahs, African cheetahs, you bring them to, and these are not Asiatic cheetahs. If anybody had that expectation that the African cheetahs you bring to India, and immediately upon coming to India, they would be so happy that finally this is the good land that I have come to, and they would be elated with joy and they would survive forever after that, that is setting a wrong expectation in itself. This was very much expected, but then it is about managing that. It is about managing their loss. And that also includes not keeping them in enclosures for a very long period of time. That also includes proper management and research and tracking of the pest. That also includes ensuring that their hunting capability is something which is sharpened, because all these predators, be it the tigers, be it the lions, be it the cheetahs, be it the leopards, when do they start to die? When do they die naturally? When they are unable to hunt anymore. Right? You would have heard that the tigers have a tiger, XYZ tiger, basically that has died because it has gotten old. It is not because of old age that they die immediately. It is because initially, when they start growing older, their ability to hunt reduces significantly. And once the ability to hunt reduces, that is when the other predators come into that area for competition. And that is when, in that fight or tussle, they get injured and damaged. And then further, the ability of hunt is further reduced. Anyways, when these big cats they go out to hunt, their success rate is close to around 10 to 20%. That is every 10 times, let's say, that they go out to hunt, they will be successful only once or twice. Rest of them, they will end up spending their energy. So if the ability to hunt reduces, they are unable to get access to food. And in those cases, in the case of, let's say, tiger, lion, leopard, now these sightings that happen in the human habitations, why do they happen? Mostly you will find that the older species, they get sighted in the human habitations, because once they are unable to hunt those particular natural prey that they feed upon, that is then when they venture into the human habitations, because that is where they get the easiest prey. And they are not preying upon humans, by the way. They prey upon the cattle, the domestic animals, domesticated species, because there it is easier to hunt. Right? I hope that is understood. Almost half of cheetah have died or are unfit for wild in India. Yes, that is true. And anybody who expected otherwise would be living in a very kind of impractical world, so to say. Why cheetahs are only concentrated in some regions of India? Because they have been introduced. Cheetahs, Asiatic cheetahs, which were to be found in India, they have been basically pushed. We have successfully managed to put them into extinction. In India, cheetahs were officially extinct in 1952. After that, relocation program has been initiated for a very, very long period of time. For some period, some of the cheetahs were reintroduced, but all of them died. Right? This relocation has not happened for the first time. This is the third time in the past century that the relocation of cheetahs have happened. The first time that it happened was in the early 1900s, when the Scindias of Gwalior, they brought in certain number of cheetahs. And when they brought in these cheetahs, Obviously their ability to hunt was not significant, and they entered into human habitations, and after that they had to be hunted and killed. So that was the first failed attempt. Second failed attempt happened when some of these cheetahs were introduced in the region of Uttar Pradesh, the protected areas of Uttar Pradesh. Now, initially, there was, again, just like in the present scenario, there was an increase in population. Few of them reproduced, but then all of them, they died due to some or the other adverse conditions. This is the third attempt that we are making. Okay. So it is not something that for the first time is being done. We will talk about the entire process of it when we talk about cheetah relocation program. Okay. Grasslands are best suited for these large animals? Yes, the tropical grasslands in particular. Now, then you have the degradation of life quality due to deforestation. We have talked about disturbance of the native people, the forest dwellers who have lived there for centuries altogether. Then there is also a significant impact created on the carbon sequestration, the ability to capture carbon, that is impacted quite significantly. Okay. Now, then we come to the role of oceans when it comes to climate change. It's unethical to cheetah population. Okay, yes, in a way you can say so, that when you consider the animal rights, it is no longer, it is not at all justified to bring them to an area where they will die. But then you understand one aspect of it, that, or that is one viewpoint which is completely correct. The other viewpoint can be that cheetahs, just like any big cats, they are also very important for the maintenance of the natural ecological balance. Cheetahs have not been produced here or brought here for, let's say, ornamental purposes. You do need the a check on the herbivore population. You do need the fittest of the herbivore population also to survive, for which you don't have, you need to have multiple different predators. Just having tiger population will never be sufficient. This Indian subcontinent that we are so very proud of, that has such a great amount of biodiversity, this Indian subcontinent at one point of time around 200 years back, if you think about it, had the presence of lions spread across the central part of the India and many parts in southern India as well, had significant presence of cheetahs, had significant presence of tigers, had significant presence of leopards, and that ensured ecological balance. It is a different matter. We have hunted them all into extinction. And that is why the, yes, the food web. So for that, you need a diversity of herbivores, you need a diversity of predators as well. Okay, you cannot have one apex predator. If something, let's say, were to happen to that species of predator, a disease might spread to that particular predator, then what will happen? Then the entire ecosystem will crumble. For example, in Tanzania, in the Serengeti region, you had the canine distemper virus. And that canine distemper virus, in one swipe, it managed to kill 1,000 African lions. 1,000 African lions died in one go. So imagine, nature has its own way of functioning. We are only trying to play our own role in ensuring that nature is conserved. Okay. Sundaresh, life quality. Life quality in terms of deforestation is associated with the ecosystem services provided by the forest. For example, the cooling, the temperature, cooler temperature which is provided. For example, even the availability of water in various streams, seasonal streams, etc. So, for example, take the case of Sikkim, take the case of, I know Manipur right now is famous for all the wrong reasons, but take the case of Sikkim, Manipur. Now, in many of these areas, the traditional source of drinking water would be associated with these seasonal streams, which would be generated during the rainfall. But now, in all these areas, either you have floods or you have dry spell. So that continuous movement of streams, that has been so much disturbed, that availability of drinking water in itself is something which has been put into question. Okay. Now, Asif, my question is from coral reefs. What is the major cause of coral bleaching? pollution in oceans, warm waters, chemicals in ocean, oil spills. So even pollution can lead to coral bleaching. Oil spill can also lead to coral bleaching. But just the existence of warm and chemicals will not lead to bleaching. But if there is a chemical pollution, if there is a kind of, let's suppose, you have an excessive warming of water, that can lead to coral bleaching. So if there was an option of multiple answers being correct, that would have been the correct answer in this case. Otherwise, if you have to select one out of them, then oil spill can be taken, but pollution can also be taken in that. Okay, Asif, one out of them. So better to choose pollution in oceans. But then this would be a very incorrect question, so to say. I think in this case, in these cases, oftentimes, especially in the state services, UPSC has got a lot of ego with it. So UPSC never cancels a question. In the case of state services, they are very, very flexible. So they might end up awarding marks to everyone. But otherwise, oil spills, pollution, both of them will work here. Okay. Now, then we come to the portion of role of oceans. Now, as I told you, oceans themselves, they end up taking in or capturing significant amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they capture that and store that from the air water interface. That is when they take in carbon dioxide. So they help to moderate the earth's average surface temperature and hence the climate by removing around 25 to 30% of the CO2 pumped in the lower atmosphere by the human activities. So almost one fourth of the anthropogenic carbon dioxide which is emitted, that is absorbed by the oceans. Now they absorb heat from the lower atmosphere, and then the ocean currents that are present, that circulates that heat, because across the planet we have heat surplus areas and heat deficit areas. Heat surplus areas are restricted around the region of the lower latitude. Heat deficit areas are present in the higher latitude. So that is where the circulation of the oceans is very, very important. Now, which circulation of the ocean here are we talking about? We are talking about both ocean currents, but more majorly about the, very good, thermohaline circulation. Circulation. For static nodes, PPT and ARM are enough. Yes, yes, more than enough, more than sufficient. Few of the data pointers with regards to the species, etc., you can refer to the books. But other than that, just keep on harping on the current affairs, because if you are thorough with current affairs, even your static portion keeps on getting revised. So for the static portion of environment, the PPT additional reading material more than sufficient. Now, solubility. Now, this is an important point that I was making yesterday as well. That once the oceanic water becomes very hot or becomes warm, rather than absorbing the CO2, it starts releasing the CO2 up into the atmosphere. Okay, so solubility of CO2 in ocean water decreases with increasing temperature. So as oceans warm up, some of their dissolved CO2 is released into the lower atmosphere. Just like you have a warm soda drink. Now, when it is warmer, it will have a lot of effervescence, lot of bubbling activity. So that is where you have the CO2 in a similar manner. CO2 is also released from the ocean. So that is why warmer oceans are net emitters of CO2. Warmer oceans are net emitters of CO2. Okay. Now, then we come to ocean acidification. What do we mean by acidification? So when for any substance or any solution, the pH value reduces less than 7 or gets lower by less than 7, that is when we say that the substance or that particular, let's say, substrate has become acidic. Now, the reduction in the pH value which is happening, That can be referred to as acidification. Now, for the past few decades, the rate at which the ocean pH value is reducing is something that the planet has not witnessed for many, many millions of years. So, again, just like climate change, it is the rate at which it is happening which is quite concerning and which is quite disturbing at the same time. So, in the 200 plus years since the Industrial Revolution began, concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has increased due to human activities. During this time, significant amount of anthropogenic CO2 has been absorbed by the oceans. Now, once the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere will increase, there will be a forced absorption of CO2 by the oceans as well. And when you have greater or excess amount of CO2 pushed into the oceanic water, what it will lead to is basically an increased amount of acidification. Okay, so ocean acidification is happening at a rate faster than any time in the past 650,000 years, that is 6.5 lakh years. In that large span of time, this amount of acidification has never happened. Having said that, when we talk about ocean acidification, just a moment, guys. So, having said that, when we talk about ocean acidification, you have to understand that oceanic water is still alkaline. It is not acidic. Oceanic water is still alkaline. Many of us, while studying about ocean acidification, we have a kind of a misconception that oceanic water has already turned acidic. But that is not the case. It is still largely alkaline with a pH value of around 8.1. Okay, this is something, please keep that in mind. It is still alkaline, but that pH value is reducing at an incredibly fast rate. And whenever the ocean turns acidic, the impact on the species is very apparent and very significant. We'll take a look at few of the examples as well, that what are the impacts created. Now, this is something I want you to reproduce in the mains examination. If a question comes about ocean acidification, obviously I don't want you to reproduce these images, because I understand that for that you need to be a drawing maestro to be able to do so. So I'm not expecting you to reproduce this, but the aspect of ocean acidification needs to be highlighted. So when you have increased CO2 which is absorbed from the atmosphere, now we do know that in the oceans you have the presence of various ions such as calcium, such as carbonate. Now, ideally, various different shell-bearing animals, such as mollusks, crustaceans, cnidaria, for example, corals, which are an example of cnidaria. Now, all these species which bear a shell or which develop an exoskeleton, they synthesize that calcium ion, carbonate ion, put them together, build a calcium carbonate shell around them or a calcium carbonate exoskeleton around them. And for all of these species, you will observe that their internal body is very, very soft. They are soft bodied organisms. That is why to protect them, they have a shell around them. Right? Now, once there is an increased amount of carbon dioxide absorption, that carbon dioxide, it interacts with water, obviously. It will start reacting with the carbonate ion as well. The carbonate ion, which otherwise would have been used by the species, which otherwise would have been used by species such as shell bearing animals, crustaceans, mollusks, corals, etc. Now, this carbonate ion is consumed. So that means lesser availability of carbonate ions for the various species. Now, this is used to produce bicarbonate. That cannot be used by the various species, not to be utilized by the species. cannot be used by the species. Now, these bicarbonate ions further end up producing carbonic acid, right? Produces carbonic acid. Okay, and that ends up creating acidification of oceanic water in general. And as you can see, consumption of carbonate ion impedes calcification. Now, whenever the availability of carbonate reduces, for example, if you take the case of the corals that we have studied, now these corals, they will never be able to construct a calcium carbonate exoskeleton around them. That means their skeleton or their structure will be very weak. That means they will be very prone to bleaching as well, right? So ocean acidification has got a direct impact on coral bleaching. For example, here in this particular image, you have the depiction of a species that is referred to as a pteropod, right? The pteropod. Now, pteropods, these are very small shelled animals that you find at the bottom of the sea floor, in the obviously photic zone as well, significantly, and also sometimes moving around. Now, these are considered to be just like analogous to chips that you have. Now, why? Because when you talk about the chips that we consume, now that is something that is consumed by almost every kind of individual, right? All of us, we will consume. If somebody is offered chips, they will consume that. Be it the older population, the younger population, any of them will consume that. Similarly, these pteropods, they are consumed by almost all the species in the marine ecosystem, and they provide a healthy source of nourishment as well. But then slowly and steadily, due to the increased acidification, these pteropods, they are unable to manufacture that shell anymore. And not only is that shell structure weakening, eventually their survivability will be put to test. If the rate of acidification continues, then these pteropods won't be able to survive, because these are soft-bodied organisms. That will impact the marine food chain and the provision of nutrient for the marine food chain. Okay. Now, here, changes in ocean chemistry can affect the behavior of even non-calcifying organisms. Even the non-shell bearing organisms, they are also impacted because of the changes in ocean chemistry. How? So you would observe that ability of some fish, such as the clownfish, to detect predators is decreased in more acidic waters. The decreased pH levels impact the ability of the larval clownfish to locate suitable habitat. And when they are unable to locate suitable habitat, they are very open to be consumed by the predators. So the population density or the population composition in itself, that is impacted. So when you are unable to locate a suitable habitat, then what happens? Survivability becomes very tough. Okay, and then they can easily be hunted and consumed by the predator species as well. Now here, observe that how this human activity overall, this is a kind of a multiple impact or the multiple various different effects that the human or the anthropogenic emission of carbon dioxide ends up causing in the region of the ocean. So here, observe this. First of all, due to human activities, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases. When the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide increases, the greenhouse effect also increases. When the greenhouse effect increases, there is increased warming, right? Increased heating. Now, that increased heating increases the ocean temperature. Once the ocean temperature increases, what happens? Ocean becomes emitter of CO2, right? CO2 is emitted as a result of increasing ocean temperature. Meanwhile, this CO2, which is pushed in larger quantities in the atmosphere, means there will be greater amount of CO2 which will be pushed into the water as well. That means the acidity will increase. Acidity will increase means survivability of many species will be put at risk. And all of this will lead to atmospheric disturbances where greater amount of cyclonic events will happen, greater amount of thunderstorms and storm surges will happen because of increased rate of heating. And coastal ecosystem will also be impacted, corals will also be impacted, and disturbance of organisms with calcareous structures. In many of the areas, due to rising temperature, migration of species has also been happening. Now, all the species are slowly migrating to cooler waters. Now, when multiple species they start migrating to cooler waters, what will happen? There will be a resource crunch. The amount of resources available for the species that will reduce. So that is where competition and again phasing out of weeding out of many different species. Right? So that migration will end up having its own kind of consequences as well. Many of the organisms they indicate a very changed behavioral pattern. For example, as has been indicated, with increased amount of temperature or marine heat waves which have been occurring, many of the species such as whales, they have been found to be greater amount of entanglement in the older fish nets, etc., due to the changed animal pattern, where their behavior becomes very haphazard, very sporadic. And that is when, because of excessively warmer waters, because please understand, excessively warmer waters does not mean that the water temperature has to be 50 degrees Celsius. Even if the water temperature departs from the normal by 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, it is very huge. Because for the marine species, we do know that the thermal tolerance of the marine species is very low. Why? Because traditionally and historically, the temperature has been maintained at a consistent level in these regions. The temperature has been always maintained to be consistent in the regions when we talk about these marine areas of water bodies, because the temperature does not change drastically over the water bodies. Okay, so that is the overall impact. Now, due to climate change, there is also a change in the precipitation patterns. How? So there is an increased level of warming in many of the areas, right? So increased precipitation is predicted in the polar and subpolar region, whereas decreased precipitation is projected for the middle latitudes of both hemispheres. Now, increased precipitation for polar and subpolar regions because of what? Because in these areas, as the region becomes warmer, there will be increased amount of evaporation over a period of time. Even in equatorial region, there will be an increased amount of evaporation, and that feedback loop that we talked about, that increased vapor presence, increased evaporation means more vapor presence, means more heating, so that will increase the amount of rainfall even near the region of equator, isn't it? But that will end up causing changed rainfall patterns, dispersed rainfall patterns. Rather than receiving a uniform amount of rainfall, you have very sporadically distributed amount of rainfall which is received. Any doubts that we have till now? I hope there is no hesitation in terms of asking doubts. Any doubts that you have, feel free to ask. Okay? PYQs we'll discuss. We'll try to discuss after we cover a substantial portion. We'll try to discuss that. Now, then, after that, this is the changed rainfall pattern which will be experienced or which is expected to happen. So, here you will observe that the equatorial areas, some areas in the Western Indian Ocean and the polar regions, there will be increased amount of precipitation which will happen. Now, again, I will ask this, that all of us, we have covered the portion of geography earlier, right? So I'll assume that we have no doubts in the portion of geography which has been completed earlier. Good. So now apply your logic and tell me, why is it that there's a projection of decreased rainfall in the mid latitudes? Due to increased warming, why is it that the amount of rainfall received in mid latitudes of both hemispheres is expected to reduce? Apply your logic of geography here. Subtropical high pressure is not relevant for mid latitude rainfall. Anyways, high pressure will never end up creating rainfall. Think about it. Why is it that mid latitudes receive rainfall? Jet streams, jet streams, they can carry the low pressure systems, but in themselves, jet streams will never end up causing rainfall. That if that would have been the reason, then wherever jet streams would have existed, they would have caused rainfall, isn't it? More land heat. Benita, you are the closest. Temperate cyclones, you have said. You are the closest in terms of the answer. Not westerlies, not more land heat. So think about it a bit more. It is basically in the mid latitudes you receive rainfall because of occurrence of fronts, isn't it? Are we aware about or have we recalled the portion of fronts? Yes. So in the mid latitudes, we have frontal rainfall in majority of the areas. Now that frontal rainfall is caused when you have from one region cold air is coming, from another region warmer air is coming. That is when the frontal formation takes place. Yes. Now, if let's say the polar region starts getting warmer, then can we say that there will be lesser amount of frontogenesis? The amount of frontogenesis which will be caused, or the front formation which will be caused, will be reduced quite drastically. So that is where the natural occurrence of rainfall will be hampered. Is that something which can happen? Good. So that is the reason why the mid latitudes are going to experience lesser amount of rainfall, because you won't have enough amount of front formation. Now, after, see, ideally I wouldn't expect a normal individual to be talking about this, but because you have covered geography and I have ensured that you have covered geography in such detail, I have that expectation from you. So that is why I need you to be able to dig deep into these conceptual portions. Now, due to increased amount of warming, there will be increased occurrence and increased frequency of droughts also, which will happen. Now, droughts are what? Prolonged dry spell, right? So as the prolonged dry spells they increase, the growth of trees and the other plants, that will decline. There will be increased amount of crop failure, large amount of dry spells, many of the natural biodiversity will be pushed out. Okay. Now here, which reduces the removal of CO2. Other plants, once you have the decline in the number of other plants, so that means what? You will have the removal of CO2, which will be impacted. Ideally, the plants will take in CO2, but the plants, when they start failing, the removal of CO2 will also be impacted. And that will further warm up the environment. That will lead to forest fire, wildfires in the case of tropical grasslands. And whenever that happens, that further adds CO2 to the atmosphere, exaggerates the level of warming. Level of warming. Okay. So that is something which the entire world will be witness to. Ankit, sorry, sir, diverting from topic. I'm unable to score marks in human geography optional. Can you tell me strategy regarding this? Ankit, remind me at the end of the session if you can, if you will be kind enough. I'll tell you about it. Okay, 5 minutes before the end of the session. Remind me about that. Human geography is where you require a basic understanding from your observation, from your understanding. We'll talk about it, that when it comes to optional, what is it that the evaluator seeks, what is it that the UPSC is searching for in the portion of human geography. Okay. Now, then comes the portion of melting of ice and snow. So, because of increased warming, particularly in the region of the poles, there has been an increased rate of melting of ice and snow. Deglaciation has happened. So, for example, here if you observe this present whitish portion that you see, that is the present extent of the Arctic sea ice, which is reducing at an incredible pace. Just to indicate to you that this is the Arctic sea boundary which would exist in the 1970s. Observe the marked reduction. The reduction has been very immense. Now, I hope that we are also able to establish a direct relation between the Arctic melting and increased warming of the Arctic and further melting. Because once the ice starts to melt, the water will be exposed. Water absorbs more amount of solar rays, so the temperature will increase, which will further exaggerate the rate of melting. So this is the reason why all the various different countries in the Arctic region, they have a huge temptation, and all of them are vying for the oil reserves which are found to be present in this area. Russia has claimed a significant portion as its own region. Russia has developed the nuclear shipbreaker, icebreaker as well, where the nuclear powered icebreaker ship, which can be deployed in the Arctic throughout. And as you can expect, when there is a clamor or when there is a rush of resources, China will be there as well. So while other countries are vying for a kind of an access to the region of the Arctic, and there is a kind of a dialogue, etc., China, what it has done, it has basically declared the establishment of a polar Silk Route, a kind of a Silk Route which would pass through the poles. And it has very cleverly and tactfully said that, you see, this is a part of the polar Silk Route which we are trying to develop for the transportation purposes. But obviously, everybody knows that behind this, China is also interested in the oil reserves in that region. And in that aspect, India's Arctic policy is quite forward looking for that matter. Because when it comes to India, India's Arctic policy never even talks about the portion of resource extraction. We purely talk about the fact that, look, in the region of Arctic, we need to understand the Arctic in order to understand climate change. We need to understand the people surrounding the region of the Arctic in order to connect them to the people living in mountainous areas of our country. So that is why India's Arctic policy is very forward looking, because for India it is not a matter of significant amount of competition. For India, it is a matter that whether you import oil from this area or whether you import from Saudi Arabia or whether you import from Iraq, the end result is you have to import it anyways. So that is why India knows that where its limitation lies in terms of sudden capturing of the natural resources. But nonetheless, due to this melting, this is a kind of an image and a realistic representation of what has happened in the terms of melting. So this is the glacier, the glacial ice, right? This was in 1941. Observe the same region in 1941 and the same region in 2004. You will not find the presence of glacier whatsoever. And this is not only restricted to Arctic, my dear friends. Even in the region of Antarctica, there have been places across the coastline which have now started remaining ice free throughout the year. So you have flowering plants, perennial flowering plants, which have come into existence even in the region of Antarctica. So this is the rate at which the glaciers are melting. Again, observe the glacial retreat in the region of 1941 in Alaska, where all of this would be covered with ice. Observe this area now. You have water and ice is restricted and has been retreating there. So the impact is very significant. One of the impact of climate change is the rise of sea level. The sea level has been rising at an incredible pace. And here we touch upon a point of current affairs. Here we touch upon one of the reports which has been indicated by World Meteorological Organization. Now, basically, why is it that the sea level is rising due to climate change? So there are multiple factors for them. One is the melting of ice and glaciers and snow, melting of ice and glaciers and snow, right? That has increased the sea level. Second reason is due to increased heating, there has been a thermal expansion of water. Of water. That is, any substance, any material, when it is heated beyond a particular level, it will always indicate a kind of an expansion. So that has also been observed in the particular water bodies. So there has been a thermal expansion of water. So for the past 50 years, if you consider on an average, this has been one of the major indicators or one of the major factors for the rise of sea level. However, in the past couple of decades, this melting of ice and snow has also been significantly responsible. So sea level rise threatens several low-lying small islands. This is indicated by the World Meteorological Report of 2022, which has been released in the first part of this year, that is around the time of February. That is when this has been released. Now, the impact of average sea level rise also increases the amount of storm surges, and the variations in tides, they get exaggerated by the process. Now, overall, if you take a look at the trend, now overall the global mean sea level rise has been around 0 0.2 meters from the era of 1901 to around 2018. But then this has not been uniform. Observe this. Average sea level rise for the 7 decades between 1901 to 1971 was 1.3 millimeter per year. Between 1971 to 2006, 1.9 millimeter per year. 2006 to 2018, that is only for 12 years, 3.7 millimeter per year. And now when you consider the entire span between 2013 to 20, in the last decade, the sea level has risen in the last decade itself by a whopping 4.5 millimeter per year. So the rate at which it is increasing, the sea level is rising, that is very, very high. Okay, so that is ever increasing. Observe that this particular graph indicates the rate at which the sea level has been rising. Now that rate has been turning out to be exponential for the past decade, which has indicated around 4 millimeter per year rise in the past decade itself. Now, thermal expansion of water, where due to heating there has been an expansion in the water column. So thermal expansion explained 50% of the sea level rise during the entire span between 1971 to 2018, while ice loss from glaciers contributed 22% and 20%. Now, here the rate of ice sheet loss has been increasing for the past couple of decades. So for the past couple of decades, if you consider that, the rate of rise of sea level due to ice loss has been very significant. Now, what is the consequence of it? What is the future about? So over the next 2000 years, the global mean sea level rise will rise by about 2 to 3 meters. 2 to 3 meters. That means many regions across the coastline, across the world, including many of the low-lying island territories, the poorer nations particularly, they will be completely wiped out and covered by the sea, because 2 to 3 meters of sea level rise is very high, right? But if this rate of warming, the rate at which we are warming the planet, if that continues, it won't be restricted to 2 to 3 meters. The sea level can rise by almost 19 to 22 meters. 19 to 22 meters is as high as a 3-story, 4-story building. So imagine if the sea level would rise by that much. Many of our coastal territories would be completely submerged by the sea. Right? Then we will have the historical accounts. If mankind prevails for that long, we will have historical accounts of how at one point of time you had the glorious growth or the glorious cities which would be present across the coastline. Okay. Now, this is something which the earth has witnessed in the past as well, but this has been over a long period of time, over the period of time of warming and cooling which has happened. But that rate has been accelerated quite significantly in the recent past. So, overall, likely 5 to 10 meter higher than today. That is something which was experienced around 125,000 years when the global temperatures were around zero point 0.5 to 1.5 degrees Celsius higher than the present, right? And then 5 to 25 meters higher, which was around 3 million years back when the global temperatures were much warmer. So again, we are reverting to those conditions, but the difference is that we are reverting to those conditions at a very fast rate. That can be difficult for our survival as well. Now, due to significant amount of climate change and global warming, there will be a change in the food production pattern as well. How? So when we talk about the change in food production pattern, first of all, you have to understand that due to warming in the immediate future, there will be an increase in the global food production. Why? Because the colder areas, the temperate regions, the subpolar regions, which are very, very cold to support agricultural growth and agricultural production as of now, they will get warm enough in order to carry out the food production. They will get significantly warmer, isn't it? But then, over a period of time, these areas, when they get very warm, there will be crop failures. For example, in India also, we have been witnessing for the past couple of years, due to heat waves and frequent heat waves, the grains produced and food, let's say last year, we had a a significant amount of impact was created on the wheat production because of the frequent heat waves. So the impact will be, in the long run, will be very damaging. Okay, so crop productivity is projected to increase slightly at the mid to higher latitudes because of warming temperature, but eventually it will decrease as the rate of warming keeps on increasing. So by 2050, some 200 to 600 million of the world's poorest and most, that is 20 to 60 crore, will face malnutrition and starvation due to the change in the types of food that are grown. Now, climate change is also bringing about health issues. So you have diseases, right? When you have greater amount of warming, greater prevalence of zoonotic diseases, vector-borne diseases such as malaria, chikungunya, dengue, etc., will be spread across the world. And that is where you have to understand that even presently, the cases of, let's say, dengue, chikungunya, etc., they are restricted to the warmer countries of the world, the warmer regions of the world. Canada and these regions of Norway, Sweden, they don't have to suffer from that problem because they are in the colder region. It is much more pervasive in the African areas and the Asian regions. Why? Because of warmer environment. Now, if these warmer environments, they basically become consistent in the higher latitudes, diseases will spread. Then natural disasters such as flash floods, increased sea level rise, and epidemics will also be on the rise. Then extreme heat waves will be a commonality. So even for the past 5 years average, if you take, the number of heat waves which have been striking the region of higher and mid latitudes, that has been on the rise. Be it the region of Europe, be it the region of Canada, they have been experiencing frequent heat waves. So that frequency of heat waves will be further pushed up. Variability of rainfall and occurrence of drought is something we have already seen. Also, because of this climate change, you will observe, or we all will experience, greater occurrence of tropical cyclones. Because for the occurrence of tropical cyclones, there is one requirement: warmer sea water. Whenever you have warmer sea water, that creates a low pressure, which will end up creating that tropical cyclone. But as the water, even in the temperate regions, are warming up, there also you will have these cyclonic formations and these thunderstorm formations. Not only that, increased temperature of the ocean means very acute low pressure will develop. And acute low pressure means the cyclones will be much more powerful. The wind will be much more powerful. So the impact created by them will also be very significant. Damage will be very significant. Okay. So there will be an increase in the intensity and increase in the frequency in the frequency and increase in the areas impacted by cyclones. Okay, then coral bleaching is something that we have talked about. Due to warming, coral bleaching will happen, and also there is an increased rate of acidification also, which will lead to significant amount of bleaching. There will be migration of both human as well as the animals, large scale migration. When we talk about humans, so human migration due to climate change will happen or has been happening already because of frequent crop failures in certain areas, because of continuously rising sea level. So there is already a human migration which has been happening in that area, right? But then this migration will continue to increase, and that is where low lying regions such as the Sundarbanch delta in Bangladesh, there already a large scale migration has been happening. Frequent crop failures in the region of Syria resulted in large level of unemployment, large level of failing incomes, and we saw what the outcome was when you had almost everyone forced to take up arms in certain cases, or being forced to migrate. So that is where both human as well as animal migration will happen. Both human and animal. So when we talk about human based migration, here we talk about the existence of or the presence of, due to climate change, you have frequent disasters, in an area. If subsequently and continuously year after year you have flash floods, people will migrate from that area, isn't it? Crop failures, rising sea level. Whereas when we talk about the animal migrations, this would include terrestrial, marine, and aviary species. All of them will begin to migrate in larger proportions. Now, these are basically the list of impacts about climate change which will have in India. Now, most of them we have almost all of them we have already discussed. That basically you have extreme heat conditions, frequent heat waves, which will have health impact as well. Then changing rainfall pattern, droughts followed by floods and increased amount of disaster. Now there will be a greater, when you have increased heat wave and increased climate change, increased level of warming, greater and an exorbitant rate of exploitation of groundwater will also be observed. Glacial melt, which will impact the water security in almost entirety of the northern part of India, because that is where the rivers, the perennial rivers, they are supported by the melting of the ice and snow from the Himalayan region. Sea level rise will also have an impact across the coastal community. Agriculture and food security will be impacted. Energy security will be impacted. Why? Because the energy, because of increased heating, due to increased heating, warming, energy requirement increases. When the energy requirement increases, availability of energy for all, of energy for all, becomes a risk. So you'll have greater power outages, greater impact on the economy will also be created. So if a question comes about the impact of climate change on India, just have a compilation of all of the points that we have discussed earlier, including the aspect of coral bleaching, including the increased intensity of cyclones. All of that needs to be brought to the table. Okay. Then, mitigation strategies, that how to prevent or how to, in a way, conserve the environment from that impact of climate change. That is mitigation. So, one of the role or one of the portions can be carbon sequestration. What do we understand by carbon sequestration? So it is the long-term storage of carbon dioxide or other forms of carbon in various different places, maybe industrial sites, power stations, older mines, etc. Anywhere where you store that carbon dioxide. That is what is carbon sequestration. You store that, cap that for a longer period of time. So it is carried out by pumping carbon into the various carbon sinks. Carbon sinks are those areas which naturally will absorb carbon. So you have the natural carbon sinks such as oceans, forests, soil, etc. You have the artificial sinks as well, depleted oil reserves, the unminable mines where you cannot extract any more out of it. So these are your areas where the carbon can be stored. And over a period of time, let's suppose in a kind of an old coal mine, you end up storing all that carbon that will interact with the carbon molecules present in the mine. It can produce syngas or other energy fuel as well, right? In the depleted oil reserve, if you store excess amount of carbon dioxide, it will provide for a better extraction of oil as well, because it will create a pressure. It will end up allowing better extraction as well. So when we talk about the types of carbon sequestration, you have different types. For example, ocean sequestration, that is where carbon dioxide is directly stored by the oceanic water, as we have discussed from the air water interface and interchange. Then geological sequestration, which happens in the Earth's deep surface at the depth. So geological storage, when you carry it out in the old depleted oil gas reserve, it will lead to enhanced recovery, unminable coal beds, or even in deep saline formations, you can store them, right? Deep saline formations which are present significantly deeper into the Earth's crust, there you can store them. Terrestrial sequestration is basically when you store that carbon into the trees and the plants around. That is terrestrial sequestration. Okay. Then we have the concept of green and blue carbon that we have already discussed. What is green carbon? So it is the carbon removed by photosynthesis and stored in the plants and soil of natural ecosystem. That is green carbon. Blue carbon, which is stored in the marine carbon sinks held by the marine organisms and sediments. And by the way, if let's say the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will increase, will it lead to increase in the amount of vegetation or reduction in the amount of green cover? What do you think will happen? If the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases, will it lead to the increase in green cover or will it lead to the reduction in green cover? Avni, Benita, correct. So immediately it will lead to an increase in the green cover, because it will lead to an increase in the rate of photosynthesis. If you have more carbon dioxide which is present, it will lead to an increase in photosynthesis. And the green plants for the near term future, they will start increasing in quantity. That is what is also referred to as carbon fertilization. As we have discussed earlier as well, upon the evolution of the planet, you had a phase when the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increased quite substantially. And it is at that point of time when you had the generation or speciation of larger plants. Many of the larger plants, they came into existence. Complex forms of plants, they came into existence. So that is carbon fertilization. So increase in green cover due to, this can be also referred to as a temporary increase in green cover due to increase in CO2 in atmosphere. Okay, due to increased rate of photosynthesis. Okay, then we come across what is referred to as carbon offsetting. What is that? So basically, it is where, let's suppose you have been given a target. You have been given a target in terms of the carbon emission, right? So first of all, carbon offsets are credits for reduction in greenhouse gas emissions made at a different location, made at another location, such as wind farms, which create renewable energy and reduce the requirement of the fossil fuel energy. So they are quantified and sold in metric tons of carbon equivalent. So it is like a carbon credit. So for example, let's suppose as a country A, you have been given a target. You cannot emit more than this. You are unable to achieve that target. So in order to achieve that target, just like the tradable EPR certificates we have discussed, you will buy the carbon credits, right? Buy carbon credits to achieve the targets. Carbon credits to achieve the targets. Okay, so where do you get those credits from? So let's suppose this country A in one other place, rather than using the process of various, or rather than going for, uh, let's say, a kind of a direct reduction, which it cannot do, it will install a kind of a renewable energy generation facility, or it will install a more technologically advanced methodology of production, which will be less carbon intensive, or which will emit less carbon. So for that, it will be rewarded with some amount of credit in return. For example, any new installation that it has carried out where it is meeting the energy requirements, and where, let's suppose, it has reduced the carbon dioxide emission by 5 tons. So in that case, it will be given with a credit of 5 tons of certificate. And that credit or certificate will be utilized to meet the target. So in this way, you are promoting the use of renewables. You are also, over a long run, promoting the reduction of emission. So carbon offsetting in the long run promotes the reduction in emission. Over a long run, promotes reduction in emissions. Okay. Now, there is a carbon tax as well, where you fix a kind of a ceiling, upper ceiling, that if you emit more than this, you will have to pay tax for this, right? So that carbon tax is the potential alternative to that trade, cap and trade of carbon credit. So all of this we will study in the portion of Kyoto Protocol next week. But basically, this is again where a target is fixed and you cannot emit anymore. If you are emitting any more than that, then for per ton of carbon dioxide that you are emitting, you have to pay an exorbitant amount of tax for the process. So this aim is to cause less fossil fuel use and cause an incentive, bring about an incentive for using other sources of energy in the process. There is also geoengineering, which can be carried out. This again is relevant for your prelims. Geoengineering, which can be carried out. Now, what is this geoengineering? This is an artificial methodology in order to provide a rate of cooling. Geoengineering is to provide some or the other rate of cooling, artificial methodology. So here it aims at modifying and cooling the Earth's environment, defeating the or in a way nullifying the environmental damage and ensuring climate change or ensuing climate change to make the planet more habitable. So brings about methodologies to bring about cooling. So how can that be done? Basically by hoisting parasols. Parasols, they will reflect sunlight, right? What are these parasols? For example, in many of the areas you would have seen this kind of an architectural setup. These are what are referred to as parasols. What will this do? It will reflect the sunlight and provide cooling in the process. Then placing mirrors in space, if we can do that, that will also reflect sunlight, reduce the amount of heating. Then whitening the stratosphere with sulfate aerosols. Why? Because earlier we have talked about the fact that sulfate aerosols indicate negative forcing. So that will bring about an additional amount of cooling because of reflection, isn't it? This is also what is referred to as creation of an artificial volcanic condition. Why? Because when we have a volcanic eruption, whenever, wherever, it will relieve or it will end up emitting such a huge amount of carbon dioxide concentration into the atmosphere that or rather sulfur dioxide concentration into the atmosphere, that sulfur dioxide will combine with the vapor and it will form aerosols which reflect sunlight. So that region receives cooling process. Okay, so that is why whitening the stratosphere with sulfate aerosols, whitewashing building roofs to reflect sunlight to again increase the rate of albedo, then flinging iron filings into the ocean to promote carbon gulping algae. Now, what is this? So, this is basically about increasing nutrient supply to the oceans to increase the growth of phytoplanktons. Now, these phytoplanktons consume CO2 by the process of or for the process of photosynthesis. Okay, so they consume CO2 for the process of photosynthesis. And if the oceans naturally, without acidification, if they naturally gain the capacity to consume CO2, that means greater amount of CO2 absorption from the atmosphere. So greater absorption from the atmosphere, absorption from atmosphere. So that is basically the impact of geoengineering or the various different factors which can bring about artificial cooling. So here you have a kind of a schematic representation of how various different methods of carbon sequestration as well as geoengineering can achieve a kind of a cooling. Okay. Please, last 10 minutes, give some questions based on concept, like why mid-latitude regions get low rainfall. Okay, fair enough. One of the conceptual portions we just now covered, that is how is it that iron filings will end up creating a kind of uh, increased carbon sequestration. Okay, so now we come over to the portion of biodiversity. Now here, also from the portion of the climate change, and here also it is very, very important for us to keep a track of current affairs. As and when we are proceeding ahead with the modules, we have covered the portion of the static, and now we are graduating in the portion where the dynamic area becomes very important, right? Where the topics keep on changing with almost every month in terms of their relevance, in terms of their newer bits of information. So here also, please keep a track of the portion of current affairs in the long run as well. So in the biodiversity here, what is biodiversity? The various species of animals, plants, etc., which are prevalent in the ecosystem. That is what is biodiversity overall. So when we talk about biodiversity, it has got various different elements associated. For example, you have the case of ecological diversity. Now, what is this ecological diversity? So, for example, here in any region, if you have different types of ecosystems which exist, there will be greater amount of biodiversity and a greater resilience of the ecosystem as well. If you have the same kind of ecosystem which exists throughout and everywhere, now they will be not very resilient. Impact of climate change or impact of any external factor will have a debilitating consequence. So ecological diversity is the diversity of ecosystems. Diversity of ecosystems. Now, then we have the species diversity. Now, this is also equally important because, as we were just talking about in the case of the cheetah relocation and reintroduction, that why that has been important, and we could have done without reintroduction of cheetahs as well. It is morally, ethically wrong on the part of the cheetahs. There we have carried out injustice, but you have to understand, in any ecosystem, greater the variety of species, greater the different types of species in terms of herbivores, in terms of carnivores, in terms of prey, in terms of predators, there will be a greater resilience for those species. The ecosystem will have various different sources from which it can attain nourishment. And that brings about sustainability to the ecosystem in the long run as well. Okay, now that is the aspect of the total different types of species which can exist in a region, and that is species diversity. Then we have genetic diversity. So even in the same species, it is very important to have the diversity in terms of the genetics. For example, here I take the example of lion reintroduction and lion relocation. So, lions, not reintroduction, but relocation. As per Project Lion, there has been an increased effort to relocate lions from the region of Gir. In India, as you might be aware, that all the lions that we have are Asiatic lions. Now, Asiatic lions, when we say genetic diversity, what do we mean by that? For example, the Asiatic cheetah, African cheetah represent two different genetics. In the case of tigers, you have the Amur tiger, you have basically the Royal Bengal tiger, the Sumatran tiger, the extinct Tanzanian tiger, the Caspian tiger. These represent the different types of genetics. So, for example, in the case of lion relocation, now there has been an increased clamor call from the side of the environmentalists and the biologists that we need to relocate the lions. Why? Because in India, we have only one species of or one genetics of lion, and that is the Asiatic lion. At one point of time, it was spread over large parts of the country. But presently, it is concentrated only in one portion, and that is the Gir ranges and the Gir forests. Now, there, once you have all the lions restricted in that region, what is the outcome or the consequence of that? Even if there is one such disease spread, like the canine distemper virus that we have talked about, even if that disease spreads in that region, it can virtually mean the wipeout of the entire species of that region. It can push the species to extinction. So either have the genetic diversity or have the regional diversity, where you spread them across various regions, so that in one region, if the lions are impacted because of lack of food or because of a kind of a pest or a kind of a disease, the other lions are protected. So genetic diversity is a must for resilience of a particular species. Okay. Then you have the functional diversity. What do we mean by functional diversity? It ends up indicating that in an ecosystem, we have already seen in the previous weekend itself, that you have various different functionalities, various different roles, various different biogeochemical cycles, various different food chain, food web network, various different pyramids as well. So greater the diversity of functions in terms of the recycling, energy flow, etc., greater is the source of food, greater is the source of, let's say, predator prey relationship, more resilient will be the ecosystem, more resilient will be the biodiversity in general as well. So that is why all these are the various different types of diversity which are required. Okay, excuse me. Then we have what is referred to as the scales of diversity. How do we end up measuring diversity? So you have the measurement in the form of alpha diversity, beta diversity, and also what is gamma diversity. So let us understand that with the help of examples. So when we talk about alpha diversity, what is the meaning of alpha diversity? So when you consider any particular ecosystem, the various variety or the diversity of species in that ecosystem, that is alpha diversity. If I consider an ecosystem, let's say a pond ecosystem or a forest, or rather let's consider a kind of a marshland ecosystem. So in that ecosystem, the diversity of species, that gives us alpha diversity. Then what do we mean by beta diversity? So that is when, let's suppose you compare two different ecosystems, right? And you compare the diversity of species in between these ecosystems. What is the diversity of species in a lake ecosystem and what is the diversity of species, let's say, in a riverine ecosystem? So when you compare that diversity between them, that indicates a beta diversity. And then when you consider a large landscape which consists of many different ecosystems, for example, consider biome. So when you compare the diversity or consider the diversity in between the two different biomes for that matter, that will give you gamma diversity. Okay. So all these are the scales of diversity. So here the schematic representation can be indicated. So if let's say this is an ecosystem, this is an ecosystem A, this is the ecosystem B, and so on. So within that ecosystem, you get alpha diversity. Within that, that is where you get the alpha diversity. When you compare these two ecosystems, that is your beta diversity within a larger biome, for example. When you compare two of them separately, that is what gives you the gamma diversity. Okay, that is what gives you the presence of gamma diversity. Now, then you have the classification of the biodiversity in terms of the role that any particular species plays in the entire ecosystem, or the role that a species plays in the environment overall. So you have indicator species, keystone species, you have the flagship species, and you also have the foundation species. What are those? So first of all, understand the basic of it, and then we'll take the help of the various examples to understand it further. So when we talk about the types of species, what do we mean by indicator species? These are those kinds of species which give us an idea about the health of the ecosystem, right? So they give us, or they indicate the health of the ecosystem, indicate the health of an ecosystem. Those are included in the indicator species. So when we say the health of the ecosystem, basically, if the ecosystem is polluted or not. For example, lichens. Now, lichen, we have already talked about earlier in the last week as well. So when we talk about lichens, these will always grow in the regions which have cleaner air, always. And in the region where you have significant amount of sulfur dioxide pollution, these will never grow. By the way, lichens, again I will ask, is a symbiotic relationship between which species? When we talk about lichens, they represent a symbiotic relationship between which species? Algae and fungi. Good. So algae and fungi, they exist together to form lichens. Similarly, take the case of, let's say, corals. Now, corals will give you an indication about the health of the marine environment, the marine or the aquatic ecosystem. Then, for example, if you consider like that, you have many different species which will give you an idea about the health of it. Then you have the keystone species. Keystone is basically an architectural terminology. Keystone represents that particular construction of a building which holds the weight of the building. It came into prominence whenever you had the building of the arches in the Middle Ages. Majority of the buildings had lot and large amount of arches. Now those arches were supported on multiple pillars, and those pillars would rest on those keystones. So that is why these were the basis, or the considered to be important for the existence of the entire building. So when we talk about keystone species, their survivability is important for the maintenance of the entire ecosystem. That is what is keystone. So here, species whose presence is important for the maintenance of the entire ecosystem. Can we have an example for that? Any example for keystone? Elephant, yes. Tiger, very good. So tigers, elephants, their survivability is important for the survivability of the entire ecosystem. Okay, because let's suppose in the case of the grassland ecosystem, these elephants, they are very, very important for the maintenance of the grassland as well, with the continuous uprooting of the trees and the maintenance of a pathway, ensuring there is not an overgrowth. Everything is done by the elephant, gardeners of the grassland ecosystem, as we had discussed. Tigers, for example, these are important in order to ensure that the herbivore population remains in check. And if that is important in order to keep the producer community thriving, Otherwise, the herbivores would continue to overgraze, and they would basically make the entire region devoid of any plant or any kind of producer community at all. Then we have the flagship species. Flagships are those which gain a larger symbol, which always indicate a larger symbol, much larger than them. For example, they indicate, let's say, conservation of an ecosystem. They'll convey the conservation of animal species for that matter. Example, you have, can we have the example of such of them? They exhibit a larger message of conservation, for example. For example, you have the koalas, right? You have the pandas. Now, pandas, they are, panda population is conserved to be, or is considered to be synonymous with conservation of animals itself, right? When we talk about the elephants, they have been indicated as mascots of conservation or mascot against hunting of various species. So these are those particular species who are used as a larger indicate or a larger messenger for an ecosystem's conservation, or which are used as conveying a larger message. Then you have foundation species. The foundation species are those which lay the foundation for any particular ecosystem, which create a basis of foundation for any particular kind of ecosystem. They are foundation species. So here, indicator species, this is your lichens. So include crayfish as indicators of the freshwater quality, right? Corals as indicators of marine processes such as siltation, seawater rise, seawater temperature. Then peregrine falcons as indicator of the pesticide load, because wherever you have high amount of pesticide load, peregrine falcons won't be found, because if these falcons, they basically consume what? The small rodents such as mice, etc. Now, if there is a pesticide load, that means these rats would be, or the small mices, etc., they would be impacted by this pesticide, and these falcons would then get impacted, and that would lead to their death as well. Then lichens as air pollution indicators, especially sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere. So all of them can be used as indicator species. They represent indicator species. Keystone, it is an organism that helps define an entire ecosystem. Without the keystone species, the ecosystem would be dramatically different or cease to exist altogether. So example, elephants, tigers, etc. Okay. Then flagship species, they act as a symbol for environmental habitat, movement, campaign, or an issue. So they can be mascots for the entire ecosystem. Example, you have the panda population, you have the elephant population, all of them, they are used as mascots for larger conservational purposes. Then you have the foundation species. Now, foundation species, they play a major role in creating the entire ecosystem or the base work for the entire ecosystem in itself. So they play a major role in creating or maintaining a habitat. For example, corals. Now, corals, once they start habitating or they start colonizing an area, then after that, significantly different number of species will also come to that area, because there will be availability of food, there will be availability of shelter. Now, none of those species would have come to that region had it not been for the corals. So they become the foundation for that particular ecosystem. Okay. Then we come across the concept of ecosystem engineers. Engineers, in not in the present context that we have in our country, where everywhere you find engineers out there, myself being one of them, but basically when we talk about engineers, they are known to be builders, right? They are known to create something. So when we talk about ecosystem engineers, these are basically those particular kind of species which modify their environment in a way, and that modifies the entire kind of species living around, the nutrient availability living around all of them. So they can either modify their own body structure, they can modify their own body morphology, or they have the ability to modify their ecosystem. That is what is referred to as ecosystem engineers. So you have two types or classification of ecosystem engineers is of two types. One is autogenic. Now, autogenic ecosystem engineers, they physically change or they change their own body morphology, right? They change their environment by modifying their own biology. For example, let's suppose you have a kind of a plant, a small sapling. Now, in its younger stage, these plants will have few insects that will roam around, few of the flies, etc., that will roam around. That is it. But when this plant grows and develops into a very large wooded tree, then the kind of ecosystem which will prevail, the kind of various species which will be present there, that will be significantly different. Here you will have many types of birds, many types of various different insects, large number of various and few of the reptiles as well. Maybe few of the arboreal species will also come into play. So the type of species, the entire ecosystem is changed. Why? Because this particular species has changed its own body morphology, isn't it? It has been able to change its own body morphology overall, and it has been able to change its own biological structure, and that is where it has been able to provide support to a different kinds of species altogether, isn't it? So this is an example of an autogenic engineer, that is trees. From sapling to a healthy or a large tree, the entire setup changes. Then allogenic engineers, they physically change their environmental setup from one condition to another. So, for example, here, let's take the case of one of the largest or the one of the most intelligent uh, allogenic engineers, or one of the most intelligent species out there, and that is what is beavers. Beavers are not very commonly found in India. Beavers generally are to be present in the region of Europe and North America, and they exist in fresh water. Now, what these beavers will do is that, let's say you have a movement of river, right? They require fresh water. Now, these are referred to as the nature's greatest dam builders. They construct very significant number of dams overall. So when you have these beavers, now let's suppose this is a river which is moving. Now, when they want to reproduce, or because for the growth of their young ones, they require a gestation period, they require enough availability of nutrients. So what they do is, with the help of various different, any material that they would find, they can even use construction debris, the construction waste. They even make use of that. They can make use of branches of trees, trunks, etc. Anything that they find, and they know how to construct a dam. They will dam the water so that there is a very little flow after that. Most of the water starts accumulating. So then the types of species that you will find will be very, very different. You will have greater amount of microbes, you will have greater amount of nutrients available in the water, and that is what the beavers require, the young ones will require. So that is where very famous beaver dams, they come into construction, which causes large scale water logging in these areas. And they do know where to put in the kind of mud in order to join the various construction materials together. So that is where what nature has created. Now these are allogenic, where they change their environment from one state to another. From flowing water, they have changed it into static freshwater systems. Okay, invasive alien species, they oftentimes they also end up changing their surrounding. We'll talk more about it in the coming weekend. So that is where we'll restrict the session here for today, and in the coming weekend, now we'll be talking about the portion of, and we'll be discussing almost all the PYQs in the coming weekend. Okay, so we'll be talking about the various different PYQs and also the international conventions. That is something which is left for the next Saturday, which will be the last session. That is where we'll be concentrating upon them. Okay, now let us take a few questions. Okay, Ankit, you had a question about the strategy regarding human geography optional. So, see, in the portion of human geography, always try to form a linkage with the portion of physical aspect of geography, the physical geography that you have studied. Any question which is asked in the portion of human geography, try to put in the principles that you have studied in the portion of physical geography. Try to form an interrelation. And secondly, for example, let's suppose you are talking about even the let's say the location of industries for that matter. So there, put in the physical aspect of geography, that the topographical variation, give the examples. Examples are what carries weightage. And secondly, always try to substantiate your answer wherever required. Whenever you are writing a way forward, try to highlight some of the government schemes. That is also a very scoring thing. So if you are able to, for example, let's suppose we talk about Weber's theory, or we talk about the Van Thunen's model of agriculture. So in that, wherever required, talk about or highlight the government schemes in that process or in that area. So government schemes in way forward portion, examples across the world and India specific in particular, and linkage with physical geography. If you are able to do that, you will get good marks. I hope that solves your query. If you have a question specific query, any portion of human geography, feel free to ask. And for preparation of prelims 2024, Akshay, I would always suggest to you that the best way is to finish the portion of general studies as early as possible and revise it at least 3 to 4 times before the prelims paper. But much more important is to start appearing for the test series. Current affairs revision is something which I'm sure you would be carrying out on a daily basis or at least on a weekly basis as of now. From the portion or from the month of late October, I want you to start appearing for the test series. Do not miss out on any test series and keep a separate file. Every test series that you appear for. Now, after the marks are declared, have a division, how many of what kind of questions you committed a mistake because there you knew it but there was a silly error, or you did not know it, right? So any portions that you did not know, write it down in that piece of paper, compile it. At the end of those 3,000, 4,000 questions that you attempt, you should have those compilations, and that would form a revision. Every time that you appear for a test, it should be with the mindset that you are appearing for the prelims. Because prelims examination nowadays is as much as a mental exercise, where if your mind is calm, sharpened, you will be able to score. Okay? Right. And I hope, Akshay, that is something which is understood. Then, can I rely for current affairs webinar Thursday monthly magazine? I'm now making notes for current affairs. See, Asif, yes, webinars, they are very important and will be significant for your mains preparation. That will help you prepare for the mains examination. The portion of the Thursday webinars that I have been covering, I have ensured that the mains area is addressed by that. The monthly magazine, if you are following, please ensure that every month's magazine you revise it significantly. And this is not something that I have read the monthly magazine of March, now I'll read April, May, June, July. No, by the time that you have read the March magazine, it should be revised at least twice in the month of June, because otherwise you will forget. And then the March, April, May together has to be revised again in July. So like that, a kind of an accumulated and compounded revision, you carry it out and stick to the basics, more than sufficient. Okay. How many times should we revise the magazine? Ideally, each of the months should be revised minimum of 5 times, minimum, because there are so many intricate details. And see, understand, your greatest enemy is going to be negative marking. Your greatest enemy is not that question for which you don't have any clue. Your enemy is that question which you have studied earlier, but you are not sure what is the answer, because you are confused that what I have studied. Have I studied this particular portion? Have I studied that particular portion? That is your enemy. So for that, multiple revisions are a must. Okay. Benita, yes, Avni, that is required. That much revision is required. Benita, from when do we start answer writing for the mains? As early as possible. If you are appearing for the exam next year, ideally, presently, you should be also studying, or I'm sure you would be carrying out your preparation for the optional as well. So now is the time that you start practicing for the portion of answer writing as well. Okay, that is why I suggest all of you that try to attempt the mains test series. Don't send it for evaluation if you are that having that reservation, but try to put pen to paper. And that answer writing should be carried out as of now. Maybe every day you devote time for one answer. Maybe on a weekend you write two answers. That you carry it out, and then it is in the month of December, January where you accelerate it, where per day you are writing at least five answers. And then mid January onwards, start devoting preparation for your prelims. Okay. Asif, send a mail. I will take it forward. I will provide you with the required details. Send a mail. If you, I have to give the exam in 2025, monthly magazine, 5 times revision from now only. Yes, why not? A newspaper revision is something, newspaper reading, Avni, is, see, if you are appearing for 2025, do one thing, stick to the newspapers, revise the monthly. See, there is no point reading current affairs if you are not able to recall that. So, won't it be advantageous for you if you are appearing for 2025? Have the aim, my dear friend, that I will have a rank in top two, top 100. That should be your aim. If you have that much time, it is absolute injustice to yourself, your resources that you are investing, that I will somehow scrape through in the in maybe second or third attempt. Have that goal that in 2025 I will get a double digit rank. So how will that happen? You will have to put in more amount of time. My mail ID is okay. Gulam, Avni, I hope that is taken in a positive manner. I'm not trying to overcomplicate your work here, but please understand, more than revising the current affairs 5 times right now, you also have to pay attention to coverage of the general studies. There is no way otherwise. GS, and there are some easy scoring areas. Polity, for example, these are the low hanging fruits. Ensure that it is revised so many times and so many questions are practiced. So for you also, I would suggest that take the prelims test series with earnest amount of sincerity. Gulam, prelims also is prelims for that, as I have told you, that is where the improvement will happen. It is good that you are scoring good in the answer writing, but for prelims, multiple revisions are required, my dear friend. Okay. So that is where I'll end the session here. And till we meet again next weekend, take care of yourself, revise, most importantly, relax. See you again. Goodbye. Good night. Thank you.